What's up, assholes? Got another bike review for you today. This is the Santa Cruz Bronson V5, the most current version. Santa Cruz lent me out this bike and the V2 to test against each other, but I put a decent amount of time on this thing now, so I thought I'd do a full review on this bike. And I guess while Santa Cruz, lent me the bikes, I'm giving them back. They're not reviewing the video. Besides this little deal, I'm not really affiliated with Santa Cruz. I think you guys know that I'm kind of being honest about these bikes, but just wanted to lay that out for you. With that being said, I guess to sum it up, I don't think this bike does anything incredibly well. It doesn't have a superpower here or like a really big weakness there. I feel like this is one of the more well-rounded bikes I've ridden in a long time. This just made me really happy on it most of the time. I have little complaints here and there, but I think this is a bike you can show up to 90-95% of rides and be pretty stoked on. I'll start by diving into the suspension. It doesn't feel incredibly plush, but what I appreciate is it has very, very good feel. And I think it has a lot of good support in the first half to 2/3 of the travel. I think some bikes fall into a little bit of a trap with trying to make them too plush, and then you just end up blowing through that first part of the travel. And that also affects the feel the bike has. What I appreciate about this suspension and how it feels is it's very, very predictable. I feel like I have a very good sense of where the wheel is at in the travel, and I feel like that helps me judge traction. And when you do push this bike, it stays fairly composed. On the other end, I don't think it's really the most comfortable riding bike, but I am willing to give up a little bit of comfort for control, consistency, and something I really trust. It translates my energy really well to the trail. I feel like I can pump it decently, but really more than anything, it's just a sense and confidence and understanding of what the rear end of the bike is doing. And I feel like I'm getting a lot of information. And if I compare this to the Specialized 15, which is not too dissimilar in travel category, but I think as I have come to ride this bike and think about the Stumpy 15 more, what I really missed out of that bike was a sense of predictability and a feel from the suspension. It being super plush performed really well in some situations, but it was really hard to feel connected to what the rear end was doing. And then when it changed character at a certain point in the travel, when it changed air cans, it was hard to really predict and understand exactly what the bike was going to do when it got to that point in the travel. With this, it kind of made me appreciate having a good feeling for, just what was happening with the rear end. Even if it wasn't necessarily good all the time, I knew what was going on, which in turn gave me confidence, and I could deal with, it being maybe a little harsh in some situations because I knew what it was going to do. And I think that kind of, again, translates into the Geo. It's not anything crazy. I would say the standout thing when it comes to the geometry and fit of this bike is it has a fairly high front end, but then reach and chainstay wise, it's all very moderate numbers. I appreciate that they're maybe a little bit shorter on the reach, 478, and then the chainstay is a 442. Head angle is a 63.9 in the low setting. I rode it exclusively in the low setting, so sorry I didn't try the high, but it's a fairly small adjustment. I found that the high stack height makes you feel very safe. I rode a pretty insane downhill track on it, something that's no joke. And even though the bike was sometimes getting overwhelmed, I always felt in kind of a safe position. When it comes to the balance and cornering of the bike, I felt like the front wheel had enough weight on it where it wasn't a constant problem for me. I wasn't really having to manage it. And even with, a fairly high front end, I can't think of any big surprising front end washouts. So the front end is fairly planted. The chainstay feels fairly easy to manage. It's still pretty maneuverable, easy to get up on the rear wheel. So I think it's a handling characteristic that's going to make a lot of people happy. It doesn't sit in one extreme or the other. But the combination of all those numbers and the stack being fairly high, I did feel like I wasn't super over the front and I wasn't initiating corners with the front. That's not really how the bike wanted to be ridden. I found myself Scandi flicking and drifting the shit out of this bike to corner it. And I feel like for whatever reason, that's the way it wanted to work. And I had enough confidence in the front to like initiate drifts and not be super scared the front end was going to go on me. But what this bike tends to want you to do is just like drift it everywhere. Like I'll play some clips here of me riding out here, and you know, I was trying to sauce it up a little bit, but it's also feels like the bike works really well in that manner. And I think that is also like a bit of a character of mullet bikes, just with the front axle being a little higher in the front, lower in the rear. I feel like the bikes like to be drifted like that, and it doesn't feel as good to like initiate with and carb with both tires at the same time. I don't know. That might not be the best way to describe that feeling. But whatever the case is, I was doing Scandi flicks on this thing, like what it do, and it felt pretty good doing it. So yeah, maybe felt like a little rearward for flatter terrain, but I don't know. On most trails, it felt like I was just in a really comfortable position. I knew what the bike was going to do from a suspension standpoint, and the handling was quite predictable from a geometry standpoint. I never felt like I had to put myself in a really exposed position to do what I wanted to do on the bike. So whatever happened, I felt like I was like ready to deal with it, even if it didn't play out how I initially thought. But to wrap things up, generally, I would say, you know, bikes in this category are interesting. You know, 150, 160, it's like they have pretty high ceilings, but I guess they're still considered trail bikes. I would say the personality of this bike, it feels more like a big little bike than a little big bike, you know? I feel like it punches above its weight as far as like the composure and the ceiling of the bike. You know, a counter example to that of like a little big bike is like the Ibis HD6. I rode my buddy Evan's HD6, and like that bike has a ton of travel, way more travel than this, you know, had a coil shock and a big fork, and it felt like light and dainty for that travel category. And so that's an example of like a big little bike. This is kind of the opposite. The chassis of the bike just feels solid. It feels on the stiffer side of things. That's something I wanted to touch on, is like the frame stiffness. Just feels like solid, composed. Again, maybe doesn't track as well, but like to go along with the suspension, like still maybe not the most forgiving, but very, very predictable and responds well to rider input. So with all that being said, yeah, I really enjoyed riding this bike. I feel like I was fairly in tune with it. It allowed me to ride trails in a fun way while still being like fairly confidence inspiring. If I were to search for anything with this bike, it would be maybe a little bit more comfort in the suspension. I was getting, I'd say, a decent amount of feedback through the feed. So other things on the bike, I will say this drivetrain was loud. I'm not going to put it all down to the bike. My B tension was having trouble staying put. So this could be just this could have something to do with the derailleur on this specific bike, but it definitely wasn't the quietest. But besides that little issue, the spec was great. Still big fan of the Mavens. This Fox suspension, I think, is in a pretty good place. Again, going on the fork, I kind of ran it slightly lower air pressure, higher compression, the old Henry Quinney setup, which seemed to be fairly good. I just put the shock at the recommended pressure, you know, off the Santa Cruz website with the recommended compression settings. I think I may have gone a click faster on the rear and like maybe added a bit of compression, but I thought the suspension settings from the Santa Cruz website were pretty much spot on. Oh, climbing, sorry, it's like I barely even talk about climbing. Climbed good. Climbed like a modern trail bike. Didn't blow me away. Didn't hold me back. I don't know. Bikes climb pretty good these days. I'm not the best person to comment on the climbing. You know, front end had it feel like a fairly comfortable climbing position. Just felt neutral, kind of with the whole theme of the bike. The climbing position just felt pretty neutral and comfortable. And, you know, personal preference wise, especially after riding the V2, it's kind of funny how close these bikes were on speed. But, you know, if you guys haven't seen that video yet, definitely check it out. I mean, I would still choose this one to ride hands down, but it was interesting. You know, personal preference wise, if I was to be my dream bike, it could have had a little bit of a longer chainstay. I think reach is actually in a fairly good spot, maybe a tad shorter, like 475. I think for this style of bike, you know, to just have a little bit more differentiation from the Nomad and the Mega Tower. It's like, I think this style of bike, you actually can get away with a bit of a shorter reach. And I would have been really happy with like a 445, 446 chainstay. I think that would have complemented this bike even better without really hindering it that much. But you know, you guys know I'm on my long chainstay shit. But I think the important thing about this bike is even me having that preference, it still wasn't something I was really having to manage, not nearly as much as I was on other bikes. And I do think like having more support in the beginning part of the travel definitely helps with that, with cornering. It's like when you're pushing into a corner or like just holding your weight, like the rear end not sacking out helps keep weight on the front and helps keep the geometry composed through a corner. That's another thing I think I struggled with on the Stumpy 15 and some other bikes that kind of have this hammock of support in the beginning part of the travel, is that as you dive into corners, the whole weight bias of the bike goes rearwards, which makes it a little harder to drive and predict your front end traction. But, you know, there's more that goes into like the balance of the bike than just the chainstay. But I do feel like the suspension character, having that a bit more of a supportive beginning stroke, helped the bike's cornering characteristic. So I think Santa Cruz did a pretty killer job with this. I think most people will be fairly happy with it unless you're looking for that ultra cush magic carpet ride. But like I said in the beginning, you could show up to shuttle days, trail rides, most things on this bike and be pretty stoked on it. So thanks Santa Cruz for letting me borrow this thing. Think that's about it. If you guys are liking the videos, hit me up on Patreon. Also, you guys should subscribe. You know, it's cringe to be the like and subscribe guy, but I see a ton of you guys who watch the videos. Over half of you aren't subscribed, and the majority of you who are doing that have come back for at least one video. You know, my new viewership is not that high. So if you're watching these videos, if you've watched more than one of them, hook a brother up, hit that subscribe button, and yeah, be part of the club. Be part of this group of fucking assholes that likes to nerd out about bikes. Get on board. Trying to do some cool stuff with this channel and got a lot of exciting videos in the works. So, but with that being said, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace.